Ah, the 80s and 90s, what a time for movies. That golden era of cinema where blockbusters reigned supreme, video stores were packed on Friday nights, and movie studios were household names. Two of those studios, Touchstone Pictures and New Line Cinema, helped shape an entire generation of moviegoers. They gave us some of the most iconic, unforgettable films, but like many good things, their stories had an incredible rise, and eventually, a fall. Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we? Now, let's kick things off with Touchstone Pictures. Founded in 1984 by the Walt Disney Company, Touchstone was born because Disney wanted to branch out. At the time, Disney was seen as the family-friendly studio, squeaky clean and catering exclusively to kids. But they knew they had to grow beyond that if they wanted to capture older audiences. The solution? Create a new studio with more edge. And just like that, Touchstone Pictures became Disney's cooler, slightly rebellious sibling. And boy, did they hit the ground running. Their first release was the 1984 romantic comedy Splash, starring a young Tom Hanks, Daryl Hannah, Eugene Levy and John Candy. The film was a massive hit, earning nearly $70 million at the box office and snagging an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Splash proved that Touchstone wasn't afraid to take risks and do things differently from its mouse-eared parent company. More importantly, it signaled to the world that Disney could appeal to adults, too. And this was just the beginning. Touchstone followed up with more iconic films like Good Morning Vietnam, Dead Poets Society and Pretty Woman. I mean, seriously? Pretty Woman? That movie turned Julia Roberts into a superstar overnight. Touchstone was hitting home run after home run, proving that they could balance heart, humor, and depth with just the right amount of maturity for wider audiences. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Touchstone became synonymous with quality films that didn't quite fit the Disney mold, but still had the studio's seal of excellence. They were responsible for giving us Sister Act, The Rock, Armageddon, and even Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which, let's be honest, is one of the greatest blends of live action and animation ever. Touchstone Pictures was an undeniable force, but as the years rolled on, something shifted. By the 2000s, Disney's strategy began to evolve. With the rise of Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm acquisitions, Disney no longer needed Touchstone to make edgy, adult-oriented films. The studio's focus shifted back to its core brands, family films and superhero blockbusters. Sadly, Touchstone faded into the background, and in 2017, Disney officially announced that they were shutting it down. No more Splash, no more edgy Tom Hanks comedies. It was the end of an era. But man, what a run. Now on to Touchstone Pictures' rowdy cousin, New Line Cinema. If you were a movie lover in the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s, just hearing that name probably brings back a flood of memories. This was the studio that took chances, defied the odds, and gave us some of the most iconic, boundary-pushing films of its time. From small, indie beginnings to massive blockbuster success, New Line Cinema's rise and fall is one of the most fascinating stories in Hollywood. How did New Line Cinema come to be? The movies that made it a legend, and how it all eventually came to an end. New Line Cinema was founded in 1967 by a man named Robert Shea. And when I say, humble beginnings, I mean humble. Shea didn't have the backing of a big corporation or tons of funding. New Line started out as a distributor for cult films, foreign films, and, well, anything that mainstream studios didn't want to touch. The kind of movies that would play at college campuses and midnight screenings. And that worked out for them. For a while, New Line was this scrappy little company that wasn't afraid to push the envelope. But the big breakthrough came in 1984 with the release of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, think about this for a second. Before Elm Street, New Line was a pretty niche distributor. And then here comes Freddy Krueger, slashing through the horror genre and making New Line a name that everyone in Hollywood knew overnight. The film was a massive hit, and not just financially. It launched a franchise that would last for decades and pretty much defined horror for a whole generation. Nightmare on Elm Street didn't just give us one of the most iconic villains in horror history. It gave New Line the nickname, the house that Freddy built. And they were just getting started. In the late 80s and into the 90s, New Line began to evolve from a niche studio into a major player. They weren't just relying on horror anymore. Now you've got comedies like The Mask and Austin Powers, which introduced us to stars like Jim Carrey and Mike Myers in ways we hadn't seen before. These films weren't just hits, they were cultural moments. Who didn't walk around quoting Austin Powers back in the day? It was like the lines from those movies were everywhere. But New Line wasn't afraid to take risks with serious fare, either. In 1995, they released Seven, a dark, gritty thriller starring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. It was totally unlike the splashy comedies and horror films they had been known for, but it proved that New Line had range. The film was a hit and became a modern classic in the psychological thriller genre. Then came the year 2001, and what can I say? This is when New Line truly reached the peak of its power. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. New Line Cinema didn't just make a movie, they created an event, a cultural phenomenon, a global blockbuster. And here's the thing. When New Line took on The Lord of the Rings, it was a huge gamble. This wasn't a safe bet. Adapting J.R.R. Tolkien's epic trilogy into a live-action film was a massive undertaking, and it could have easily gone sideways. But New Line went all in. They committed to making all 3 films in one go, a move unheard of at the time. And it paid off in the biggest way possible. The Fellowship of the Ring was a critical and financial smash, but more than that, it became a defining moment in pop culture. The entire Lord of the Rings trilogy grossed nearly $3 billion worldwide, won numerous Academy Awards, including Best Picture for The Return of the King, and cemented New Line as one of the most successful studios of the early 2000s. But here's the thing about Hollywood, it's a tough game to stay on top. After Lord of the Rings, New Line hit a rough patch. While they still had some successes, the financial risks they took on other projects didn't pay off quite like the Middle-earth saga did. They tried to replicate the magic with the Golden Compass in 2007, but it didn't click with audiences in the same way, and it ended up being a costly misstep for the studio. Behind the scenes, things were shifting as well. By 2008, Warner Brothers, which had owned part of New Line since the mid-90s, decided to fully absorb the studio. It wasn't the end of New Line Cinema entirely. They still exist as a production label under Warner Brothers, but it was definitely the end of an era. The scrappy, independent studio that took chances and shook up Hollywood was now a part of the corporate machine. But what a run it was, right? I think what makes New Line's story so special is that they always felt like the underdog. Even when they were putting out massive hits, there was something about New Line that made you root for them. They weren't afraid to take risks. They weren't afraid to make movies that other studios wouldn't touch. Whether it was a low-budget horror film about a guy who kills you in your dreams, or one of the most ambitious fantasy epics ever put on screen, New Line had a knack for making the impossible possible. In the end, while New Line may not be the same today, the legacy they left behind is undeniable. They shaped so many of our favorite movie moments, and they proved that you don't need to be the biggest studio in town to make a huge impact. It's that kind of spirit that'll always keep New Line Cinema in our hearts. So, next time you watch A Nightmare on Elm Street, or The Mask, or The Lord of the Rings, take a second to remember the little studio that did, the one that wasn't afraid to roll the dice and forever changed the way we experience movies. And hey, isn't that what makes us fall in love with movies in the first place? That feeling of seeing something daring, something fresh, something unforgettable. That was New Line Cinema in its heyday. And man, what a legacy they've left behind. Thanks for watching Brand Saga, and let me know in the comments what your favorite Touchstone or New Line movie is. Did Freddy Krueger give you nightmares? Were you quoting Drive, Evil in middle school? Or did The Lord of the Rings make you want to head out on your own adventure? Thank you for watching another episode of Brand Saga, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more movie nostalgia.